Hi, this is the third and final installment of our three-part series on Subject to transactions. Hopefully, you've watched both of the prior installments of the Subject to videos so that we're on the same page about the lingo. And what we're talking about in this video is the different styles of Subject to transactions to help you calibrate your risk. And we'll start with some that are perhaps tend to be less risky, might be acceptable, less risky, and then we'll move to the riskiest kind of subject to transactions, which I would suggest essentially that all of you stay away from. And that's rare that I use the phrase all of you, but in the last style, I do suggest all of you avoid these transactions. All right, the first style. Technicians would say that, John, these aren't really subject to transactions, but I'm going to start with these transactions. There are certain loans that when they are originated, when they are20born, when the loans were taken out, and let's picture a low interest rate loan, being taken out in 2019 or 2020 before the Fed started raising interest rates. There are certain loans such as garden variety VA, Veterans Administration loans, and FHA residential loans that are designed to be what the industry calls assumable. That is, if the seller sells to a buyer who qualifies, the loans are designed to live. If the veteran sells to another veteran and the buyer's VA eligibility is substituted in for the seller's VA eligibility and the other boxes are checked, the loan lives and there is no stealth, there is no sneakiness. The holder of the debt consents to the buyer taking over the payments, and the buyer buys the property without getting a new loan. So in that sense, the buyer is taking title subject to the existing mortgage. Now, the reason we don't call those, or the reason technicians don't call those subject to transactions, even though the buyer is taking subject to an existing mortgage, is because there is no sneaking around the existing lender. The lender consents. The lender has the buyer assume the liability from the original borrower, the seller, and we call those assumption transactions. Those aren't the only kind of assumption transactions that can be done. Those are the assumption transactions that are most common in residential real estate, but there's two other styles that are worth having at least some awareness. One of them is that there are other kinds of government loans that have a purpose of making the world a better place. For example, there are multifamily HUD loans that are designed to subsidize the creation of affordable housing. And some of those loans are designed to live if the original borrower sells to a subsequent borrower. So it is possible that if you're listing the right property, or if you're the seller of a property that's subject to one of those kind of multifamily specific loans, it is possible that the buyer can assume the loan straightforwardly, jump through the right hoops. HUD will address HUD will bless the new buyer, and the loan will continue to live. And for those of you who are brokers, that might be a fun transaction to broker and earn a commission on. Let me also point out there's other kinds of what I'll call non-government financing, non-GSE, non-government service. I forgot what the E stands for in GSE loans, but non-Fannie Mae, non-Freddie Mac, non-FDIC bank kind of loans. There might be private party loans out there, and the private party might have carried the loan at 4%, and they might not be thrilled about the borrower taking the buyer from the original borrower taking over a loan at 4%, but maybe if the loan could be bumped up to 5.5%, then the holder of that debt might consent to the transfer to the new buyer, and the old, what was a 4% loan that's bumped up now to a 5% loan, it can be a win-win-win deal. It can be a win for the seller because the seller gets to sell the property subject to this advantageous loan. They might get released from liability. It could be a win for the buyer because the buyer gets to buy the property without having to qualify for new financing and gets a below market rate loan. At the time I'm recording this, 5% would be substantially below market. And it's a win for the lender because they're the kind of investor that would rather have a steady income flow. They'd rather not have that note paid in full. So keep that in mind as an option. All right, so that's the first category of the three. That is transactions where the holder of the debt consents to the sale to the new buyer. The buyer buys subject to the loan, but also agrees to assume and pay the loan. The industry calls that an assumption transaction. Those are relatively safe transactions as long as everybody signs off on the risk and the releases and they know what they're doing. Okay, next level of risk, and that is the property is subject to just a garden variety Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac bank loan that has a due on transfer clause in it. Let's say that original loan has a 3.5% mortgage. The transaction closes in a 7.5% mortgage market. The buyer is trying to receive the benefit of the 4% interest rate differential. You ask your clients, do you want to get permission from the existing lender for that approval? And your clients say to you, that's crazy. Why would we do that? Why would Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac or whoever holds the risk consent to that? And so they want to be stealthy about it. The transaction closes. Without getting the lender, without receiving from the lender consent to the transfer. The lender does not consent to the transfer. The lender still has its due on transfer rights. Oftentimes these transactions close with stealth. What do I mean by that? Well, the buyer's name might be Frank Scheckelgruber, and the seller's name might be John Goodman, let's say. And what Frank Scheckelgruber, the buyer, does is forms an entity called John Goodman's Property Management LLC. And so it looks like John Goodman is conveying title from John Goodman to his own LLC. In actuality, that cute name is just designed to try and fake out whoever might be monitoring those things. Other things are done to, there's going to be a new insured. The buyer needs insurance, and the buyer wants insurance in their own name. And the old insurance might be canceled or modified. Well, that's a red flag to whoever holds the debt. So people play games about trying to conceal the transfer from the original holder of the debt. That is a fraught situation. I'm suggesting it's a very fraught situation, but it's also an imperfect world. And sometimes those situations are the best bad option for the seller. And the seller, perhaps after being advised by a lawyer, might make the decision to enter in a transaction like that because it's better than the alternative, which might be letting the property go into foreclosure. So for those of you who are real estate brokers, can you earn money by brokering such a transaction? And it's a fraught thing because in a lot of these transactions, the subject to players are trying to bring $0 or very few dollars to the purchase of the property. So the classic math might be there's a $370,000 first deed of trust against the property, and the buyer is buying the property for and bringing cash essentially just to cover the transaction cost. And the buyer buys the property for $390,000 and brings $20,000 to the closing and essentially has no equity at the time of closing. Well, if things work out and interest rates continue to go down and rents hold or rents rise, that buyer is going to be able to hold on to it. But if they buy a lot of these properties especially and rents don't go up, maybe rents go down and interest rates don't fall so that the buyer is not able to refi. If the loan is called, it's a risky transaction for both the buyer and the seller. And when things go wrong, there's a substantial chance that they will blame you. One of them will blame you. Now, you might have awesome paperwork where they made informed decisions to take those risks. That paperwork may protect you against a civil lawsuit, but it's not going to protect you against your regulator. Your regulator is going to look at that, especially skeptical, and I think when in doubt, smack you, not a slap on the wrist, but smack you for brokering that kind of stealthy, sneaky subject to transaction. Then, one more style, which is something that I don't think any of us should do, and that is sneaking around FHA or VA. There is a concept that FHA does not have to sue you for anything. The federal government takes the position that doing business with the federal government is a privilege and not a right. And since it's not a right, there does not have to be any court proceeding, due process, for the federal government to say, you're too risky. We don't want to do any business with you. And so what happens is if you get caught as a principal yourself, sneaking around doing transfer clauses in FHA or VA loans, or if you broker a transaction that is sneaking around an FHA, VA, or SBA, or any other government loan, then the federal government, especially when these loans go into default quickly, they look to see who is the appraiser, if there was an appraiser. I guess that doesn't apply in a subject to transaction. Strike that. But who was the title company? Who was the listing broker? Who was the selling broker in the transaction? And then they issue a letter. It's called an LDP letter, limited denial of participation letter, that says you don't get to do business with the federal government, that federal government agency, FHA if it's an FHA loan, VA if it's a VA loan, for a year. It might contaminate just you. It might contaminate your whole brokerage firm. And think about what that means. Imagine VA issues you an LDP letter. That means not only that you cannot represent buyers who are purchasing property with a VA loan, what it also means is if you're listing a property and a buyer comes along who wants to purchase it with a VA loan, you have to jump out of the transaction. Imagine what that disclosure looks like as you're talking to the seller. Hey, seller, I'm the right listing broker for you. I'm really enthusiastic. But by the way, if the buyer happens to be a VA buyer, I'm going to have to jump out of the transaction and you're going to have to work with another broker. Not an easy problem to solve. So don't be involved in sneaky subject to transactions over over FHA, over VA, over SBA loans. Ladies and gentlemen, you know my line. It's a complicated world. Be careful out there. I'll catch you in the next video.